Okay. All right. And are we ready to do our sound check on the live stream? Okay.
So we can take these off when we start, right?
We can take these off when we start.
And then we'll just leave them off.
And we'll
the
just
entire
leave them
time.
off.
We won't try to
And
go
then
back
I
and
don't
forth.
think we'll go back and forth because it's just you and I.
Yeah.
I think if Stephanie's okay with that, we'll just do okay with that. Okay.
Check 1, 2, check 1, 2.
How is this? Is this level good right here?
Yeah,
Okay,
How about this one? Okay?
great.
Thank you.
Did we get both of them?
Hi. Great. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our adult ed class this morning. My name is Stephanie Borger, and I am here this week with Lee and Greg Foy. This is week 6 in a 7-week series called Finding Peace in Stressful Times: Christian Practices for Fostering Peace with Ourselves, Others, and Creation. And we will have some opportunities for conversation this morning, and we invite you to participate whether you are here in the sanctuary or whether you are at home. If you're watching online, the way you can share your thoughts is on Facebook in the comments section of the live stream. I will be monitoring those comments, so you can feel free to share your thoughts there in the Facebook comments. If you're here in the sanctuary, we do ask that you please use a microphone so that everyone, including our friends at home, can hear you. You can either walk up to the mic that is in the aisle, or if you'd rather raise your hand, I can bring this handheld mic to you in your seat. So whether you are at home on Facebook or here on the microphone, we welcome your conversation. So the premise of this series has been that these days, there is just so much in our world that is causing many of us anxiety and grief and stress. And we wanted to create a space to be able to be honest about those things, as well as talk about how, as Christians, we might find hope and healing in the midst of these struggles. The very first week, we read the story in the book of Genesis of the creation and the fall, when God made a good, harmonious world, and then humanity rebelled and disobeyed God. And in that act of disobedience towards God, there was brokenness in Adam and Eve's relationships with themselves, with each other, and even with creation itself. We saw shame and hiding. We saw fighting and acrimony between them. And then we even saw what had been a beautiful and symbiotic relationship with the plants and animals in the garden. We then see thorns infesting the ground and struggle and toil. So that's been our roadmap for this series. We spent the first 2 weeks hearing from some of our Stephen ministers and from some others, including Aaron Cope, about practices for fostering inner peace. Then the past 2 weeks, we had a panel including Guy and Sue Dunham and Chris Hunter and Pam Claiborne talking about what we do when we find ourselves not at peace with our neighbors. And now for our final 2 weeks, Lee and Greg Foy will be helping us explore this question of what it might mean to be peacemakers even with creation itself. Lee and Greg, in addition to being members of First Pres, are both have long careers as science educators, and they have been nationally recognized for their work, helping students come to understand and to care about this natural world that God has made. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So one of the things that I want to make sure that we get straight right from the start is we are science educators, but we're not going to focus so much on the science today as try to telling some stories. One of the things that we know in working with our students is that when we can feel connected to what's happening in God's world, that helps us understand. But today, we're going to focus a lot on our grief and our anxiety at what we know is happening in the world. And that can be hard. I remember as a child, and I'm sure you have memories too, of when you mess up and your father or mother says to you, now, let me explain to you why what you did hurt somebody else, why, how, and then let's try to make sure that doesn't happen again. That's kind of what we're going to feel today. It's not a feel-good hope, although there is that. And I just want you to know that hearing more about what's happening to God's world can make us feel anxious and scared and worried. And so one of the things that I just want to say is we're all going through this together, and we know that God has us, always is with us. So before we get started, and I also just want to say that Greg and I are not any means the perfect stewards of the earth. You can find fault with the way that we live as well. We can all be better. So we're going through this journey together. I want to start out with a quote from the Dalai Lama. He says, "Human use, population, and technology have reached that certain stage where Mother Earth no longer accepts our presence with silence." So I'd like to open up a prayer from Sylvia Keatsmott, who is working with Creation Grief curriculum up in Toronto. He's a friend, actually, of the Borgers. And so I'd like to start off with a prayer, if we could please bow our heads in prayer. Creator God, we gather together in your presence, longing for restoration for creation, forgiveness for our own brokenness and the injustice we have created, and reconciliation for the divisions that separate us. We lay our worry, anxiety, questions, doubts, and grief about the human impact on our earth at your feet and ask for your healing and wisdom. Amen.
So,
we could have the next slide. Thanks.
So we've been talking a lot about this as we've come to today, and we're both scientists, and so our natural bent is to look at the science. But what we're trying to do is look more broadly at creation, and as we're looking at creation and telling these stories, these are stories that we have experienced in essentially our scientific endeavors, and they're human stories, and they're impactful stories, and they're stories that we emotionally connected with, and so that's why we're trying to talk about those today, and it, the environment, our earth, God's earth, right? The place that we're inhabiting, how do we treat the earth? From matters of pollution to, unsustainable practices, to all of the things that we as humans are doing to the earth, those are all impacting God's creation. We're going to mention climate change throughout this because that is really the most impactful thing that humans are doing right now. And so we can't get away from that. We're going to try to minimize how much we're talking about it, but we can't get away from that because we as humans are impacting the earth in very significant ways. And so what we thought was an interesting approach and a way that we could think through this is that we could think about the Golden Rule and think about how we as humans would treat the environment. So that's where we're coming from, and that's where we're going to try to take you all. Mm-hmm. And it's really focused on caring for creation. And we want to focus on our faith and how we can instill our faith in the care for creation. If you think about what are some of the ways in which you might, as an individual, think, well, you might think that the more I know about this science, the more I am able to think through the care for creation. Or the more I focus on my religion, the more I'm going to think through this. But it actually turns out, especially in the case of climate change, it's your politics. And that's what divides this idea of climate change and how we can care for the earth in a more sustainable way. So that's one of the things that we just want to make sure that you understand how we're trying to talk through the care for creation.
And we want to focus on the faith. We
Yes.
want to focus on the faith and not the politics. So there are plenty of things that religious leaders around the world
Next
are
slide,
saying
please.
about creation. Yeah, next slide, KG, thanks. So we have Billy Graham, who says, who has passed away, but he has said, why should we be concerned about the environment? It isn't just because of the dangers we face from pollution, climate change, or other environmental problems, although these are serious. For Christians, the issue is deeper. We know God created the world and it belongs to Him, not us. Because of this, we are only stewards or trustees of God's creation. We aren't to abuse it or neglect it. And then he quotes Psalms 24:1. When we fail to see God's world as God's creation, we end up abusing it, right? We focus on the human. What can I get now? Selfishness and greed take over, and we may not end up caring about the environment or the problems we're creating for future generations. Next slide, KG, please. The Pope also has spoken out about care for creation. He's been very, very verbal about this. God gave us a beautiful garden, but we have turned it into a polluted wasteland of desolation and filth. We must not be indifferent or resigned to the loss of biodiversity and the destruction of our ecosystem. And then talking about climate change, says climate change is contributing to severe droughts, floods, fires, and extreme weather events, and heart-rending refugee crisis, which we're going to talk about in one of our impact stories. So the most vulnerable are the people that are needing economic and stability the most. African American pastors have really taken up this call. Yes, next slide. Thanks, KG. So there are a group of very active African American pastors who are encouraging their communities of people to focus on their connection with creation and also their connection with food production. And that is also a very important voice that we need to hear.
So these stories, these impact stories that we're going to talk about. We have three of these.
Yep.
And they're, like I was saying before, that it's from our experience. And so there are a couple of things that we've been doing over the last probably about 15 years. The first is taking students to the international climate negotiations, and been doing that on a yearly basis, and trying to increase awareness among those students, but then also those students increasing awareness among their peers, increasing awareness among scientists around the world. That is one of the influences, and you know, as Lee is talking about this, the African American pastors, we experienced you know, a lot of I'm not sure how to kind of explain this, but as you're walking around in these venues and you're bumping into people and talking to people, there's a lot of strife that's going on that we don't know about, and they're coming to these international events and saying, we need help. We need help. That's impactful, right?
Yeah.
That's impactful from our perspective. And then the other part of our experience is a trip that we've organized to take students to Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a fantastic place to study the effects of environmental change and sustainability. It is, you know, 15 different ecological zones that we can look at as we're traveling through that country.
A living laboratory.
A living laboratory, exactly.
All right.
So our next slide.
Next slide, please. So we have chosen from our experience 3 creation impact stories that we hope will connect with you, that we can talk about very quickly. And then at the end of these 3 stories, we have a thoughtful question that we'd like your thoughts and views on. So we're going to start off talking about farmers and climate change. And there has been a lot in the press about how climate change is impacting farmers around the world, and especially subsistence farming, right, where you're thinking about people who are farming enough to just feed their families. And obviously, extreme weather. I mean, farmers have it difficult anyway, right? They're losing land, and it's a challenge to farm anyway. But climate change is accelerating that, especially in areas like India, where we see a rise in suicides that are connected to this struggle with climate change. Next slide, please. So I had a transformative spiritual experience when I went to the International United Nations Climate Change with Greg and his students back in 2015. And I met a Kenyan farmer named Kasilu. I happened to be at this venue. I get choked up thinking about it because for the first time in my life, I heard from a human being who lived far away in Kenya trying to farm, and he became a spokesperson for his community in trying to help mitigate climate change. He went around talking about how can you plant trees. And it floored me that here is this poor farmer with a family to feed that is being a spokesperson for climate change, and it really impacted me. And there was a documentary filmer who found out about the story and made a documentary film about him. And so I have just a 3-minute clip that I'd like to play about his story. It's called Thank You for the Rain, and it really tells a great story. So I'll let KG play that video for us. It's about 3 minutes.
Has this ever happened before?
The other season we were crying, no rain. Now we are talking of flood. Everything is being contradicted.
It's crunch time at the COP21 in Paris. The objective and requirements are clear. We need a universal agreement on climate.
I'm going for my family's future. This is my chance to share my story. The story that I have is an alarm to everyone.
They have polluted our atmosphere for 200 years, and their wealth is based upon our poverty.
What are the qualities of a good father? Who is a good leader?
Are you nervous?
No. Yeah, I'm not scared in any way. I'm ready.
Thank you. So, just one story of one human being who's trying to farm and is affected by climate change with extreme weather patterns that are changing farming in Kenya. Can we have the
let's
next
go to that slide.
Okay, great.
So one of the things that was important about that story is that the extremes, right? That's what Kasilu is dealing with, and one of the things that that we wanted to point out as well is it is sustainability that we're talking about, right? As a people, this is what is stressing us a lot, is that what we're doing is not sustainable, and the impact here. This is Costa Rica, and the cattle on this area. This was a clear-cut area, right? This is what's happening in a lot of rainforest regions. Clear-cut away, cattle are raised on this. The vegetation, the grass is not that good, right? Because this is forest land and it's volcanic soil, and the cattle are actually degrading the soil as well as eating poor food. It's just this is not a good cycle. It's not sustainable.
Not sustainable.
And so that's one of the things that
Next
we
slide,
want our
Casey.
students to understand. And then the other thing that we want our students to understand is that there are ways in which we can combat this.
Mm-hmm.
And these reclamation projects are really important. On the left side, this is in that same region the other picture was taken, where the gentleman in the front, Glenn Baines, has a butterfly conservatory, but he's also reclaiming land and purchasing old ranch land and allowing it to grow back to what it was, and in fact encouraging and planting some things to make that happen. And on the right-hand side is Cabo Blanco. It's the oldest reserve in Central America, and that was just cut off from any kind of human impact other than walking through it and observing, and our students get to see how incredible that regeneration can be.
Right. So next slide, please. So after our first creation impact story, I'm going to ask you to give us some feedback. So this is a question from a wonderful book Climate Church, Climate World, How People of Faith Must Work for Change. And the question is this: God calls communities, not just individuals. We all live at the same address. Can you think of examples from human history where we have pulled together to solve a huge problem? Anybody want to speak to from history of times where something has seemed insurmountable? That's a lot of times why I think we stay rooted in our fear and grief, is because we feel this is such a big problem. What can we do? And I just didn't know if anybody had any examples of when humans have pulled together.
Or that not just that this is too big a problem, but that somebody else is going to solve it.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I mean, I think we as humans default to that. This is so big, we can't do it. The scientists are going to solve it. So politicians are going to solve it. Somebody else is going to solve it for us. One of the things that we're very familiar with is the Montreal Protocol. That was actually something that was a worldwide agreement to
President
reduce,
Reagan.
Under Ronald Reagan,
Yep.
to reduce the chlorofluorocarbon production, but that was what was eating away at the ozone layer.
Depletion of ozone.
And so
We
that
solved
was
that problem.
That was a worldwide
International
treaty that said, we're going to reduce production, we're going to try to deal with any of the other, releases of any of those chlorofluorocarbons.
And have other chemicals. And maybe if there are no comments right now, we can go on to our next creation impact story and circle back.
That's good. Friends at home, we invite you to share your thoughts in the Facebook chat.
Great. So next slide. We'll let you ruminate on that a little bit, and we'll talk about our next our next creation impact story, and that's human migration and climate justice.
So if we look around the world and we're looking at this map, the dots on there are places around the globe where the impact of climate change
And sea
is
level
going to be
rise.
the greatest.
Yes.
And a significant amount, you look at the coast, a significant amount of that is because of sea level rise. The other
1 billion
part
people.
of this, so human migration and climate justice. Again, if we focus on the regions that are impacted the
Right.
greatest,
Right.
those are some of the poorest regions in our world.
That's right.
And so that's where the term climate justice has
Right.
come from, and we're all, I
Right.
think, aware of that.
Right. So next slide, please.
So if we can bring things at least back to our country, right? We're not necessarily going to bring it into Pennsylvania right now, but we bring it back to our country, and you look at the coastline of Louisiana, and this is a satellite picture from 1932 on the left-hand side, and then 2011 on the right-hand side. That's significantly different, right? And what kind of impact does that have? Well, if you look at the little blurb at the bottom there, these are some of the first climate refugees within our own country. This island is essentially underwater now and unusable, and this tribe had to be relocated.
It was mostly fishing people,
yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so that, again, climate justice, who's impacted?
Right.
Not so much us in our everyday lives, but here are people that had to actually uproot and move.
And next slide, please. So I remember talking to my students about this, and they would say, Mrs. Foy, this is happening slowly, like move. And I'm like, well, there are a lot of people with money and means that can do that, but not everybody can, right? And so here's an example of a Bangladeshi farmer. Bangladesh is extremely vulnerable. Millions of people live at or near subsistence levels, and they are living at sea level. So here we have a situation where these fields used to be used to grow rice, to feed people, but now because of sea level rise, it's contaminated fresh water, and they can no longer grow rice. He's actually harvesting sea salt to try to make a living, but that's not food. So think about the instability of millions of people who are going to have to go somewhere, right? And we think about that responsibility and that caring. You know, what does the church do when there is a famine, right? Over in another part of the world, we care about those people. Christ tells us these are our neighbors, and so we need to care. Next slide, please. So indeed, these areas in red are places in the world where we know that climate justice is really going to be impactful. And Greg has heard from some of these people at these United Nations conferences, because this is where they are already vulnerable to other issues. We're talking Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. So as Christians, how can we work together to have these inequities addressed?
So one of the places that is impacted tremendously is if you look over just kind of above Australia, these Pacific Island nations,
right.
Tuvalu and these other island nations, similar to what happened in Louisiana, they're being impacted through sea level rise, and their land is literally being taken away by oceans, and they're forced to migrate.
Yeah.
So our next slide, please.
Next slide, thank you.
So we'd like you all to think about some examples of disproportionate impact of climate change. Communities of color, indigenous communities, poor white communities, and think about those around the world. And if you have any that come to mind and you'd like to share them with us, we'd love to hear them.
We'd love to hear those. Again, this feels like grief. This is grief. And that's okay, right? Because we can't move forward until we acknowledge what is happening and learn about it, about our brothers and sisters around the world. So next slide, please. Maybe we'll hold the questions and comments. We have one more creation impact story, and then we'll open it up to you guys giving us your feedback. So our last creation impact story is about biodiversity and creation. So we know biodiversity is all the living things that we share this beautiful planet with. And we know that the diversity of living things is taking a big hit with their human impact. And there's lots of reasons why: the degradation of the destruction of habitat, climate change, pollution is one thing we want to focus on right now. And I want to direct your attention to amphibians. They are the ones that are the hardest hit because they're really the canaries in the coal mine. They breathe through their skin, and so the impacts of pollution are often seen in our amphibians more than other animals to start with. So next slide. We have to think about plastics. So we know that our use of plastics, which are made, of course, from fossil fuels, have just reached the point where it's not sustainable. Single-use plastics are ending up in our oceans. They are gathered in 6 areas in our oceans where the current circulates, and there's these floating masses of plastic trash. And the wind and the surf break those down into little teeny particles that we call microplastics that get into our food chain and affect living things and humans as well. And for the first time, all of the man-made stuff, plastic, asphalt, cement, is greater than the mass of all living things that we have on Earth. So next slide, Casey. We have 2 stories from Costa Rica, and then we'll open it up.
So, as
Questions?
I mentioned, Costa Rica, a lot of biodiversity. One of the things that we look at is sea turtles, and there's a place in one of the stops that we make on this trip where they're releasing sea turtles, and they have a hatchery, and they're trying to bring them back to the levels that they used to be. Sea turtles have a particular problem with
Plastic bags?
plastics, because plastics look like
Jellyfish.
and so
That's
the
their main
sea
food
turtles
source.
are trying to eat plastics. That
Yep.
does not end very well. And as Lee pointed out, 8 to 10% of the oil that we pump out of the ground is going
Right.
towards these plastics. So on to our next slide, please.
Yeah, next slide.
This resplendent quetzal is
Such a beautiful
amazing.
bird.
It takes your breath away.
It does.
When you see
Yeah.
the resplendent quetzal. And this is one of the stories that kind of, we mourn as individuals, and these countries in Central America mourn as populations, because the quetzals are endangered. Why are they endangered? Well, they live at the top of the cloud forest, and on the right-hand side, at the top picture there is the cloud forest. It's what the cloud forest looks like on a typical normal day. On the bottom there, you see my students and the cloud forest, and you don't see that kind of cloud deck because it's much higher. This is an impact of a warming world. The quetzal is impacted as well because it's got nowhere to go. It's at the top of this mountain, but it has encroachment, so species are encroaching on its space. And it's a great story. It's very interesting from a scientific perspective, but it's very sad from a human perspective that this habitat is being invaded because of an increase in temperature.
Right. So next slide. So as we finish our 3 creation impact stories, and I'm sure you have waves of feelings and emotions that it's sad. We are grieving. But can we draw together? And this again is this is a wonderful book. This is Stephanie Borger's friend actually edited this. This is some beautiful stories from people around the world that are impacted by our misuse of God's creation. But this is from this book. Can we draw together a rich tapestry of lament and hope from the global church? And we want to focus more on the hope and our action as a community of Christians next week. So that's something that we can look forward to. Today, we want to just focus on how we're feeling and knowing what it is that we're doing to our world. Can breaking our hearts before piecing them back together, pointing the way forward with faith. We may still feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but learning to grieve might just be the first step toward regaining our souls. I think that's really beautiful. So we have some other discussion questions. We know we have a few minutes left. If we'd love to hear, how you're responding to these creation impact stories, any thoughts or ideas that you have.
We have some folks online who have been sharing.
Great.
In response to your first question about when people have banded together to make a change, Byron says, often not everybody pulls together, but even a small group of dedicated people make the difference, like stopping the slave trade, say.
Right, great.
Then Michelle says, not in history, but currently, states like New York and Vermont have banned plastic bags, and they're gone from all stores. She says, I love that it is one step in the process of what we can do to stop using plastic.
Right. Oh, that's great.
And then I think in response to the second question about the disproportionate harms to marginalized communities, Guy says, I think I read that in 30 years, many of our coastal communities will be experiencing flooding that once only occurred 3 to 4 times a year, occurring 3 to 4 times a month.
Right.
This will impact the poor and marginalized, especially people of color, far more than those who are not.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Good points. And we need. Are we at the end of our time now?
We are just about needing to wrap up.
Okay. Well, I'll let Greg end in prayer, but we just wanted to say that next week we want to focus more on hope and where can we go with that hope as Christians. So, if you've been sad today, we're sad too, and our collective grief can have a positive direction if we look to God to guide us.
So this is a prayer from the Reverend Peter Lippiett. So please pray with me. We thank you, Creator God, for the goodly heritage that you offer us. From green fields to the deep blue seas, and from the abundant world we share with all of your creation. Keep us so mindful of its needs and those of all with whom we share, that open to your Spirit, we may discern and practice all that makes for its well-being. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.